Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started this morning. Welcome everyone to the Legislative Issues Meeting. My name is Guy Walker, and I'm the past chairman of the 2017 chairman of the Chamber, who is one of the sponsors of the event, along with AT&T. We do have to clear the room at 10, so we should definitely get rolling because there's another group coming in right away. So there won't be much time at the end. So if we could start by standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Okay, so today the format, just to remind everybody, if you haven't been here before, we start with opening remarks from the legislators, and then while they're speaking, you can write down questions, and Dawn will come around and pick them up. And then we'll have questions for them, and then we'll finish with closing remarks. And I will try to group, sometimes there's themes in the questions, so I do try to group them and try and touch on each one. So, all right, we're going to start this morning. We're going to go the opposite direction. We're going to get wild here. So, Mr. Clays, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you, Guy. Big thank you to AT&T, the Chamber of Commerce, and of course to everyone who came out today. To the third and final of our legislative forums. We'll go through just a few items and then maybe just pick up on a few of them in the questions, because I'm sure there will be plenty on these topics. Wanted to talk first just about the current House budget. We currently have $135 million in sales tax revenue in the State Highway Fund that's protected, that will allow us to begin tackling those 23 delayed T-Works projects, completing our T-Works program before we begin this summer working on a new transportation plan to replace T-Works. Also in the budget, our corrections officers receive about a 15% raise, larger than what the governor initially proposed. He proposed matching everyone to the El Dorado raise. What we did is we went a step further. We saw the trend lines in what was happening at El Dorado actually sort of flatlining their turnover. We still had turnover at the other facilities, however, that received closer to a 5% raise. So we went ahead and bumped that up a larger amount, trying to get that trend line and curve to bend. Just seeing the evidence for what was happening at El Dorado, it became evident that just going to where the governor's recommendation was not going to be enough to really solve that problem. Our Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks law enforcement officers in this budget will receive significant raises, bringing them up to the Kansas Highway Patrol's rank and pay plan. That's been an important part of creating pay parity across those agencies, the KBI, the Kansas Highway Patrol, all of our law enforcement officers, not taking a hit if they were to transition between agencies. If someone wants to go from being a highway patrolman to going into the investigative side in the KBI, if later in their career they want to work in wildlife and parks as a law enforcement officer, that they're not taking a reduction in pay or benefits to make that transition between agencies. And that exists now in a big way. There is not a level of parity there, so trying to tackle that. Specifically, I added about $250,000 for Crisis City in Salina to receive some upgrades. That's in the National Guard budget. Those projects were canceled by the governor. We put them back in. Also reinstated the Innovation Growth Program. The Innovation Growth Program funds our small business incubators across the state. It's something that the governor had zeroed out. We put the dollars back into that. Those come from the lottery proceeds. It's not a tax type item, but it comes from what's called the Economic Development Initiatives Fund. That's funded fully by the lottery. We decided to put those dollars in because the governor also cut 40% out of the ROZ program, the Rural Opportunity Zone program. So we took some dollars and put that line item back in. That's important for us because Salina would like to have an incubator. And if we're going to have an incubator, we would like to have some source of state partnership available there, and the Innovation Growth Program is the way to do that. So putting that back in was important for us. We've also received a commitment from KDOT to participate as a partner in that incubator I just spoke about earlier. They will partner with K-State and the Salina Airport Authority to work on that project. And with that, I'll just kind of wrap up because there are several other items that I think will come up during the questioning, and certainly want to give everyone an opportunity to speak.
Good morning. Boy, nice turnout today, even though it's a little damp, but isn't it wonderful? Well, we really needed that rain, guys. I was driving in it last night, and I thought, oh, come on, hit Salina, hit Salina. It was great. Welcome to everyone. I am so excited to be here once again. I think this is really democracy in action, when you can get members of our community here to ask us questions, and hopefully we have most of the answers. I always bring my reference book just in case, can't remember them all. I think one of the big things that I truly enjoyed working on this session is the National Guard Tuition Assistance Bill. It was one that I authored and followed it diligently. There were some pitfalls there for a while, but we got them taken care of. This is offering tuition assistance to the National Guard. Our numbers in the formation of the National Guard are really strategically low at this time, and this is going to be a great incentive, I believe, to offer those students coming out of high school that want to serve will be able to continue their higher ed education. They have to serve 2 years. The unfortunate thing is that the National Guard, there's only about 26% of those who apply at this point are eligible, simply because of maybe some past discretions, but this is 100% financing for our young people, and an incentive and to fill those formations. It's very important that we continue to have the National Guard. This is a big thing for Salina, getting this bill passed. And it was quite a ceremony when the governor signed it. I mean, there were members of, I couldn't tell all their ranks, but they were sure looked good in all those uniforms. They were just a whole room full of individuals that were really happy that we were able to get this passed. The one little glitch, and I'm going to make sure that some of our representatives are knowledgeable about that, is that the Senate sliced the amount that was intended for that program in half, but I understand the governor is really going to be pushing to get that to come out of budget, and I have been in contact with the budget chair to make sure, that we don't lose out on that, and so I'll be diligently sitting in the front row watching what happens when they decide to work on that part of the budget. Some of the others in the education, there was a bill that was for dyslexia. This is we formulated a task force made up of 17 members, because this is one thing that we do find in school that sometimes gets missed. And so this task force is going to be put together because there are a lot of kids that suffer from dyslexia and go unnoticed. And I think that really curtails their ability to get the full education that they so desperately need in order to be part of the workforce in the future. But again, thanks to ANTT and the Chamber of Commerce for inviting us here once again. Looking forward to going back to session. It's going to be a tough one, but we're here, so I'm ready to answer any of your questions, and welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for being here. I'm Stephen Johnson. I represent the 108th District, and great to be with you this morning. Thanks for being here. I think you have a pretty good handle on the key issues that are before us. Representative Clays went through the overall budget issues. That will be one of the first things that we address when we go back. In fact, before we go back, the budget chairs like JR and members of the Appropriations Committee will be there. I think Wednesday is finally the decided day. Had been Tuesday for a while. To set the budget to go forward. That will be one of the biggest things to try and get done. We'll have a chance to look at a few things as we try and combine the consensus revenue estimate that came out last night at around 4 o'clock. There is some good news that is in that, but it was anticipated, so there's no surprise that was there. The only surprise was exactly how much of the revenue that we're ahead are we thinking will stay there, and it's most of it. So they increased it by about $200 million, and the the estimates had been between 200 and 300 million for this year. The increase for next year is right at 300 million, which assumes that we don't change any of the tax laws from the federal changes that will cause most of the Kansans who itemize deductions to lose that. That part is still in play. I'm not certain that 50-some million will necessarily come through in the revenue, although it is there, and they noted that they'll give an update once we work through that process. So about a 200 million increase in income tax projections ongoing, again, pretty close to anticipated, and the federal tax change, which is roughly another 100 million. They also, if you've been watching the numbers closely, I don't know why anyone would watch them that closely, but in case, they did take out the repatriation dollars, as we have not yet passed anything that relates to that side of the federal tax policy. And in fact, most of our tax policy, we haven't done a lot other than to watch what has been happening from last year's changes. The main policy that we've talked about was the possibility of having remote sellers collect income tax, which is the internet issues. It does not look like we will take action on that at this point in either the House or Senate. There is a bill that's been, actually there's a bill from last year, a bill from this year that are waiting and have been scheduled a couple of times, but has not actually made it to debate in either chamber. But making sure that it's in balance is key. There's a lot of optimism about the numbers, but it gets a little more depressing if you play them out further. If you add 200 million to this year and 300 million to next year, that matches the dollars that we are adding in education for those 2 years. But then that is more the following year and the year after that. And Dina, the way I get there is if we had roughly 100 that was added last year to the 100 that's being added this year is the 200 plus the 100 added next year. And as you play that out, the ending balance gets very close to zero. I did plug the new numbers in last night. I wound up with 35 million in 2022, which is the 5th year of the plan. And the direction isn't pretty because we actually top our 7.5% ending balance next year for the first time in a long time. If no other changes are made, it's spending that ending balance down to meet those years. So I don't have any firm numbers to do 2023 at this point, so I'd be making everything up. And I didn't run it that far out, but what I was able to see is that it would be negative at that point. So somewhere we're going to have to bend one of those curves, even though we can make it through the next 2 years fairly confidently. And that's most of what I will be looking at in the session as we try to wrap up. We'll need to make sure we know exactly what is in the education bill. If we get that back to what is intended is what I think the plan is. And so that part of the budget, the overall budget, and again, JR laid a lot of those details out. And then what small tax changes we may do to try and balance that will be what I think will be the focus of the 3 days in cleaning up some bills that are already through committees, and we'll just have conference committee reports. But thanks for being here, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, my name's Randall Hardy. I'm the state senator for the Saline County and the northern half of Dickinson County. And I'm here to provide fun facts for this morning. Everyone else did a pretty good job with some of the other things, but there's a lot of things that the legislature takes care of, and in the course of the session, not all of them wind up in the newspapers, and so I thought I'd pass along a couple of those things. First, I would like to add on to what Representative Johnson was talking about with our ending balance. That's one thing that really has me frustrated because being on the Salina City Commission for 4 years, we always tried to maintain a minimum ending balance in our budget to take care of emergency expenses, unanticipated things, and in my mind that was a reasonable and conservative way to run city government. And on the state level, that has not been the case. We feel lucky if we're at zero. And if I ever had to balance my checkbook using a zero balance every month, I would be sitting on pins and needles every day. And I know a lot of people probably are in that same boat, but you know, we can't continue to do that. We need to be responsible stewards of our money on the state level as well as on the city level, and that is something that I feel pretty strongly about. A couple of the bills that I find interesting. There's one that passed that authorizes the research of industrial hemp in the state of Kansas, and I think this is going to provide perhaps an alternative crop that is can be drought resistant and provide another stream of income for western Kansas farmers. And I have hope that research will give us information we need so that we can take that program and expand it in the following years. I'm on the Transportation Committee in the Senate, and there were a couple bills that I thought were kind of interesting. One concerns license plates. In August, the state will start producing digital license plates. They will no longer be stamped. They will be flat, and then they will have an image on the front of them. And the nice thing about this bill is that counties will no longer be required to have an inventory of all of the license plates that are produced in the state of Kansas, which is a big deal. This year alone, I think we passed 15 specialty plates. And I don't see that trend ending anytime soon. And so what would happen when you go to the driver's license office to renew, you would be given a temporary tag, and in a couple weeks then you'd be shipped your tag to put on your car at that time. So that's kind of interesting. Another thing is that we passed a bill that allows you to skip every other renewal process by being able to renew online. And as long as you can provide proof to the driver's license office that you have taken an eye exam with an optometrist, say, then you would not have to go in, and so your picture would actually be good for 12 years, which some people might find that an advantage. So anyway, that's another bill that we passed. And then another one that I think is very important is that we passed a bill that would limit the ownership of firearms to people. I mean, we would restrict the ownership of firearms to people that have been convicted of domestic violence or are of the subject of restraining orders, things that I thought was pretty much common sense. And finally, we have that in law now. And one thing that I've done personally is when somebody reaches the ripe age of 100 or better, I deliver a Senate tribute to them and a signed letter from the governor. And I've done this a remarkable number of times. You would not believe how many people are 100 in Saline and Dickinson counties. In fact, in my last trip in Salina, there were two women in the same nursing home. One was 106 and the other was 100. And I had also delivered a tribute to the 106-year-old when she was 105. And at this time, she said, "You know what? I think I'm just going to paper my room with these things." and so, you know, there are some really fun moments. And frankly, every time I've done that, it has made my day. It gives me hope for the state and the country when I get to visit with people that have that kind of history. So that is, I'm going to leave it there and be open for questions. And thank you once again for sponsoring this legislative forum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. There are probably the most questions are related to education. Maybe no big surprise. So we'll start there. The first one is, and if anybody feels particularly well versed in, and feel free to just answer, or if all of you want to comment, that's fine too. How are you going to hold the schools accountable? And what criteria is being put in place to hold them accountable for the graduation rate and things like that to make sure the funds are being used correctly? I thought that might be one you would take.
Well, I happened to bring with me this morning a copy of the $285,000 study done by Dr. Lori Taylor. And actually, if you wanted to sit down, and it's fairly easy read, it might take you a day or two. But in essence, with the contents of this, really surprised some of those who were, let's say, thinking that the schools were spending way too much money on frivolous things. Really, that we are very efficient in the operation of our schools. The difficulty is that the funding mechanisms, you know, that the teachers have to deal with are sometimes obsolete, and that we need to really start looking at funding those programs that were going to help our kids achieve when they go on to higher ed. And I brought with me our synopsis of some of the bills that passed, and I have a section here on the school K-12 Budget Committee's report on school finance. And I would be happy, I was going to be making some copies, but just simply ran out of time. But if you would like to have a copy of that particular explanation of what the whole entails of the new K-12 finance bill. Of course, now, as you understand, we are going back because there was a $80 million error. When we get the bill to vote on it, we don't always get all of the numbers, and apparently there is something in there, but I'm sure that we're going to be able to figure that out and make this move forward. Trust me, every dollar has been scrutinized by the K-12 Budget Committee. I do not sit on that budget committee. I'm on Education Committee, but I'm following it diligently as to all of the components of what they're coming up with. The local option bond and all of those little tiny intricacies that you have to watch, because it could really change the whole dynamics of portions of that particular bill. It's very complicated. Trust me, the representatives who represent our state who serve on that committee, have served long hours, lots of midnight oil, as they say. And we're still going to be going back, and that's going to be one of the first things that we have to address, is to go back there and find out how we can correct this error and then change that. But they have watched every single penny. They are not spending just frivolously and say, oh, well, we need to have this and that. This is what we have been needing for a long time. Our schools have not been adequately funded for a lengthy period of time. Our teachers have been dealing with some really enthusiastic ideas to keep things rolling, even though the funding wasn't there. And I would like to take a moment right now and thank all of the teachers. Kudos to our educational leaders there that evening when they were passing the school finance bill. All in red shirts. I see Moms Demand in action, and I'm looking at that, and I can just remember all of those red shirts. Once again, there was a large group. They were sitting on the cold marble floors, lying on the cold marble floors, because, as you know, it was a very late hour. It was after midnight, just 1 minute before midnight, so that we could continue in our 90-day session. The resolution was passed. I do have to say, though, that I would wish that maybe we could work a little bit more cooperatively between the two houses. I think at some point we felt that maybe that the House was being held hostage for a while there, because they knew that we had a resolution to pass in order to continue with the session, because our 90-day limit was right there at the bewitching hour, and we was not able to do that until 1 minute before midnight. I would like to see us, we normally work fairly cooperatively together, and I appreciate the working relation that we have with members of the Senate, one of which is sitting right to my right. and certainly no hard feelings there, but we were very anxious to get something done because we knew we had to do this. So for those of you who would like to have a copy of Senate Bill 423, I will certainly make copies of them and get them to you, because I think it's a good read, and you might see what some of the minute details. When you're doing something this complex, you have to make sure that you can watch the littlest, slightest little words difference can make in a bill and how it's going to affect. I'm very proud of the K-12 Budget Committee. They worked so diligently, and they did not give up. They kept it up in the reams and reams of paperwork, let me tell you. But I would be happy to answer some questions following this session, because there are other issues that you have questions about, but I would like to answer those. And if I do not have the answers, since I did not sit on that committee, there are some questions that I may not have an answer for, but I'll be happy to get it for you.
And I'll weigh in just a bit on that. I think this is an area of opportunity for us to continue to work on, because this really is important. And there is a balance to say, how do we make sure we have the measures we want? How do we make sure we achieve what we want? And we also don't want to be overly rigid in that, because if we don't have the right exact measure set and we over-focus on that, we can very much be counterproductive in how we spend money and get there. But that is very important. I will disagree with my colleague on the study, and she knows more than I on education. I am brand new to this. I just came into the education world at about the time the study was delivered. So I may just not have enough background, but I will tell you, it is one of the hardest reads I have had in several years. And in fact, yesterday I spent about 90 minutes reviewing logarithms and making sure I understood those relationships to continue to try to digest this study. The equation on page 91 astounds me, and as I try and put that together, you get a mean of 50 because you define the mean at 50, not because that's it. You get the group to the average proficiency of the group. It doesn't relate to whether I increased the overall proficiency or not. And if you look at the coefficients on pages 61 and 62, it tells you a lot about what's there. And the largest determinant is the percent of a district who holds a college degree on the impact of cost, which is interesting. And I would suggest that if it's the college degree that's, and it's certainly not the only one, there is a list of so many, but it's the only one with a coefficient that has a double digit in it. The rest of them are all single digit coefficients. And then to efficiency. So finding number one on page 63 is about efficiency, and it sounds really good, but given that efficiency in this context means unexplained expenditures, not necessarily waste, and it continues, so we know precisely on what we're spending money, but not whether or not that is what we want to spend money on, if that makes any sense. So we can explain with great specificity how we spend money. I think we have to continue to ask ourselves, are we really getting money to the areas that will give our teachers, our students, everyone, I probably have that backwards, our students and our teachers, the most impact for what they need to do? And that's something the legislature can work on some, but thankfully our State Board of Education, I think Randy Watson, our Commissioner of Education, has done a great job setting some goals, setting an idea of direction, and setting aspirational goals, which I think is important. I might continue to say, do we fund to aspirational goals or where do we go? But that is very important, and it's not one on which we've arrived. And I think we just have to say, how do we do that? How do we recognize that it's dynamic? And how do we say where we want to go? What do we want our students to be able to do in 2025, in 2035? And that is actually an exciting possibility, and that has to be the focus. I think it takes a combination of business, working with that, the Commissioner of Education. I think they want to do that. I think when we've done that, we will get closer to having arrived, but this will be a tough one to hit an arrival point. It's just always important to ask ourselves, what do we want to do next with any of our investments that we have, and education is one of the most exciting. So this is where we might have some answers, but we would be short of the answers, if that makes any sense. So thanks for your help in engaging on that, and we still have some work to do.
And I absolutely want to see outcomes with our investment in education. It would any time that you make an investment in something, you want to see a return on that investment. And I think that we may have settled on a graduation rate of 91% or something similar to that, and that'll be a goal. And I think that though that on our side, providing the resources to education is one part. I think on the other side, I've spent enough time in classrooms now to know that we have a group of very dedicated teachers and administrators that really want kids to succeed. And this investment will allow them to provide the resources to the classrooms that will help the kids reach that particular goal. I have no doubt that we'll see vast improvements in education from our investment by lowering class size, by providing additional resources for special ed, and a couple other areas as well. So I'm pretty confident at the moment that this investment is not only needed, but a good one for the state.
Could I make an observation relevant to those comments?
I don't know. We typically try not to do that. I apologize, but I mean, I understand people have strong thoughts probably, but I would like to ask there's quite a few questions related to education, and I think it's just a general, maybe you could quickly comment on whether or not you feel this is the sort of, I don't want to say the end, but do you think that this next session is going to be heavily focused on school funding, or will it continue into a special summer session? And so maybe somebody could.
If the general question is, it seems, is what was just passed adequate?
That would be probably
and will
the
it,
way most of them are worded.
Satisfy the court. In my judgment, no, I don't think so. I think we're back for a special session. There are a couple of pieces in there from the last opinion that lead me to that conclusion, and I think part of it is the length of the phase-in of dollars. I think that the court has had some strong opinions on that. There are some other pieces in there that I think they've taken a pretty solid stand on that I just don't know that they'll tolerate in this version. And I don't think the court is political enough to simply say, well, this is close enough and we don't want to risk what might be the political backlash of that. So I think they will probably take a more firm stand and send this back to us, and we'll be in a special session this summer.
I'll hope we're not. I don't know what the court will find, and Representative Clays is probably accurate in the assessment of a number of things that are there. And coming up with the number, and the number is bigger than one I was comfortable with as I look to the other needs in the budget. However, the $523 million of additional dollars, assuming we get back to that, which was the intention that I think everyone thought they were voting on, was arrived at from taking the finding that was suitable and adequate in Montoy, which is a case near and dear to us in Salina, and used inflation on top of that number to arrive at where we would need to be, and then took the concept from the study of implementing over time. And Representative Clays is very right that the court has not welcomed that, although that was one thing that was stressed there, and many of the school leaders, and I don't know that the state board had a huge chance to weigh in, but certainly we again talked with Commissioner Watson and the folks at the Department of Education on how do we do this, how do we make sure that money is effectively deployed also, in that a large increase of $500 million in a year, while it absolutely can do a lot of things, it is hard to deploy a large increase effectively. If I wanted to, back in business school, just to bore you with other details, an instructor used the example of saying if you wanted to dramatically increase the number of NBA teams, and this will tell you how long ago it was that I was in school, there aren't that many Michael Jordans that you can hire. So you can increase the number, but many you don't necessarily get to that same level. So that setting that plan of how you get from where you are to where you want to be is something that's important as you look at hiring the right people, not necessarily hiring the available people. And that is part of the goal of trying to work with the system, work with the budget. And that's why it's very hard to look at further out. The reality of the continued shock to the system to try and implement a number of that size within 2 years would be very challenging for every other area, and continued changes in tax policy. It'd be very hard to get a handle on it. Whether the court can recognize those other issues or not, I don't know. But the good news is we didn't just focus this year, as we did last year, on how do we meet all the needs of the state. We looked at how we met all of the needs of the state and how do we show our work, which is what they continued to stress, to say here is a number which has been found by the court to be suitable, adequate, et cetera. Apply inflation and have a number that we think is consistent with what they've been looking at. So that was part of the process to come up with a number in that magnitude, and one of the reasons it gained I think more support than I think it might have earlier with that piece behind it. So we will certainly continue to see what the court decides to do with it.
Okay, thank you very much. We will, in an effort to get to some other topics that are coming up, we will try to move past education now, but thank you for your comments. These two are generally the same question. So what is being done to make CAPERS stronger and better each year? And will the 2016 and 2017 CAPERS, the payments that were deferred or made for non-legislative government diversion, will they ever be made?
So thanks for the question. The non-legislative government,
Was it was there payments to CAPERS that were diverted for?
I'm not sure about the non-legislative part, but CAPERS in general, I'll see if I talk around it enough to hit that. And what's being done to make it stronger? A number of things. So the key things started in 2012. Then the last major thing was in 2015. And then the ongoing piece is funding. So 2012 was restructuring the liability, looking at how do we set this up over time, increasing the rate of increase in the state's contribution. Also put another burden on employees, took our tier 1 folks from 4% to 6%. So all of those things. And the state, so the state had put in about $200 million prior to 2011 per year when I got there. We put in $540 million last year. And if we make the payment, which I assume will be in our budget from the folks that I have been talking to, and an amendment I plan to make. We had it to review at Omnibus. It is Omnibus. Putting that $194 million in will get us over $600 million. So massive increases from the state's standpoint. We didn't increase by 50%. We'll have increased by about 200%. That doesn't count the additional bond payment of $60 million that we are making in addition to the CAPERS payment. It's still part of the debt. That has worked well. Even at today's market prices, we'd be up over $100 million in the interest earned over the interest paid on the bonds. So that has been a better help than we had hoped in the first years. Hopefully it continues to be average over time. So all of those things have shored up CAPERS. If we can hit $623 million, which this year's payment is just short of, we will finally start unraveling principal for the first time since before 1992. We are on pace to hit the actuarial rate next year, which is the first time since before 1992. We don't know when, we just know it hasn't happened since that point in time. That is a huge change and a huge challenge, because what we have seen historically is when we had the education suits to settle, we fell off the CAPERS plan. And we took that money and diverted it back to meet the education needs that were there. So this could be a chance that we meet both of those ongoing. And that's a big deal. Each time as we look to how we manage the budgets, it's really important that we look at which things help us in the future and which ones hurt us. I refer to them as our geese. We have geese that lay golden eggs and geese that lay grenades. And when we slay a golden egg, which would be something such as that pays dividends over time, the tobacco settlement fund, the pooled money investments, useful things, when we take those out, you can see we lost about $40 million last year from having borrowed the pooled money. Well, it got us through a year, but I lost that revenue stream. When I don't pay CAPERS, when I don't take care of roads, when I don't take care of issues in corrections adequately, those are things that blow up in the future and cost me even more. So CAPERS is one of those things. The good news is we are almost there for the first time in a long time. I believe we will add that $194 million into the budget for this year, which keeps us fully on track. That's going back and correcting. The Senate had layered that payment into the liability. We'll propose that. It is in both budgets to be fully funded next year and be at the actuarial rate now. That is next year, but it is good to at least see that it's there, and it is working in those proposals with the ending balance being at the 7.5%. So I have a fairly high confidence that we can do it. Whoever is returned to the legislature next year will be important to make sure that we stay on that track. But thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. Okay. This one is, there's quite a few questions also related to firearms, so we'll start with a few of those. The first one is, do you receive any money from the NRA, and do you support support common sense gun safety laws like universal background checks?
Insofar as receiving money from the NRA, I don't believe they give campaign contributions to our campaigns, but their lobbyists do take people to dinner, so I suppose there's probably about $20 in Buffalo Wild Wings somewhere out there floating around. And then what was the second part of the question?
Second question was, do you support common sense gun safety laws like universal background checks, as an example?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly some common sense things like Senator Hardy had talked about that make complete sense to do, like those who go through due process of law having their rights restricted because they're the subject of a restraining order or might be found to have a mental deficiency. So, you know, those kinds of things certainly supported that.
I would certainly be in support of that, especially those who have been found to have some mental issues, definitely. I believe that people, have their rights. I particularly myself would never carry a gun. I think the biggest question has been teachers having guns in classrooms. I think of the 200 emails that I received when that was first brought up. I have yet to find one that was wanting to have teachers be armed in schools. There are many reasons. First of all, a teacher has been trained to how to protect their kids, getting them enclosed, I think what we need to focus on are doors that cannot be knocked down so that we have safe areas in the schools. And I think our administrations are certainly looking into that. But to ask somebody to carry a gun and then have to actually use it. And then you also have another problem there, is when you're in a crisis situation, such as what has been occurring in our states, and you're having law enforcement surrounding and whoever else is coming to protect our schools. When they enter into that school building, anybody with a gun in their hand, how are they going to know for sure which one's the good guy and which one's the bad guy? There's always that opportunity. So an innocent teacher who's trying to protect her kids by having a gun, or him, could be that victim themselves by our own law enforcement. I really think this is something that needs to really be considered very carefully before we would pass such a bill. But the verdict at this point, in my estimation, on the emails that I have been receiving, it would not be something that I would be voting for.
I think this question was directed to everybody, so feel free to.
So no and yes would be the short answer. No, I don't have any funding that I'd receive, and yeah, I think I'd support sensible anything policy. So I hope to try and be consistent on that.
And I have never received one Buffalo Wild Wing. And I would support legislation that is along the same vein as what we've looked at already. Thank you.
Okay, so on the same topic, there's quite a few thank yous to those of you who voted on House Bill 2145 to keep the guns out of hands of domestic abusers, which that was the one Senator Hardy mentioned. But the question continues with House Bill 2042 allows 18, 19, and 20-year-olds in Kansas to carry loaded handguns in public, including college campuses and on the job in municipal buildings and grounds. Will you commit to voting no on House Bill 2042?
I'll start on this one. And I don't know that I've made up my mind yet. A lot of bills that happen, I don't have a preconceived notion about prior to debate on a bill. But I do have a hunch on this one that would seem counterintuitive on this one. Back in November, I went through the concealed carry course just to see what it was like. And it was a day of my life. It was $100, another $100 to get the little card. I haven't done that part of it yet. And my initial hunch was, no, this is not a good idea. But I'm also now thinking, well, maybe this would reduce the number of guns carried by 18, 19, 20-year-olds, because if they're anything like my kids were going through that age period, a lot of them would say, you know what, this is too much work, or it's too expensive. I don't have that kind of money. And so I'm wondering if we would actually reduce the number of firearms by allowing this bill to pass. And so that's my question, and I'm willing to take advice and comments from everyone in the audience too. But that's my thought right now.
The bill is written, it allows for 18 to 21-year-olds to carry if they get a concealed carry permit. And as Senator Hardy mentioned, that does require going through the training course. So in a way, what this does, because we have constitutional carry at 21, is it encourages those young people to go through a training process, which they then have that training when they go on and become 21. So there is a level of encouragement for training, which I think is an important piece of it. And I'll be voting yes on that, just to be clear. On that bill, but I think 18 to 21 having a training mechanism in place, and then 21 on continuing with the constitutional carry that we have in the state of Kansas is the right way to do it.
So I was trying to look up and see, because I knew there was something that balanced the 18, and it was requiring the training that had been part of where that had gotten traction to start with. And I'm trying to remember if there's anything else to it beyond that. So the one thing that would be hard to commit is until there is a final conference committee report, I don't know what will be in the thing. So to say, oh, no, I won't, I don't know that I can say, no, I'll never vote for what that would be. So if I could change things where I would actually let each campus make their own decision. I think they know how to make safety in their environment. I think that's the same in courthouses, and I'd be for local control to try and decide how to best approach that. And I'll continue to watch what's in 2042, whether it seems to get closer or further from that concept, on whether or not that's a possibility.
I think most of my question has already been answered in my explanation of it. I am a true advocate that anyone who has a gun, carries a gun, concealed or not, should go through the training course, because there are too many times that there have been accidents happen, and it happened in my neighborhood when we were dairy farming. Dad didn't put his gun away. Little boy got a hold of it, accidentally went off and shot one of the neighbor's kids, killed him as they were playing on the floor. So it's very important that they have to have that training and have to be certified. I think that would be the logistics of it. And again, I'm waiting to see what all is involved in that particular bill, but just keeping that in mind is something that I will be thinking about, because that can happen again. And there have been other instances where people just simply leave their guns laying around. One of our legislators carries one and took it out for some reason and left it on the floor in the education committee room. So, I mean, you know, these are things that you really have to look out for. So that's how I would be looking at it.
Okay, thank you. Excuse me. This question is related to pay for state employees, and Representative Clays, you mentioned several things, but this says any chance for a pay increase for state employees across the board, but then also a specific question of when is the non-security staff of the Kansas Department of Corrections going to get raises, since it takes all employees to run the prisons. So not necessarily directed towards you, Representative Clays, but you spoke about it. And
Sure. So as we've discussed before, there are definitely finite resources and a limited amount of those resources. And so what we do when we go in and tackle the budgets, and I run the budgets for KDOT, the Kansas Highway Patrol, the National Guard, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, basically all of our public safety agencies, including the Department of Corrections, and then KDOT in addition to that. When we go through that process, what we look to do is to solve problems. We're basically putting out fires at this point. It's not a luxury that we have to be able to do things like across the board pay raises or COLAs and capers or whatever it might be. What we do have the ability to do is to strategically attempt to solve problems like riots in prisons and guard shortages that have them working 16 and 18-hour shifts. That's what we had the ability to do, so that's what we did. As far as, as I'd mentioned before, across pay parity across those agencies and creating a way for people to go between agencies when it comes to wildlife and parks law enforcement officers, highway patrol, KBI, doing things like that reduces our turnover and it keeps people who are already trained in the job. One of the things that we spend a tremendous amount of money on is training our scientists with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation. It costs about $100,000 to train one of those individuals. And one of my college roommates went into this job in this field. He went to Great Bend, started work, went through the training that was extremely costly. We later find out when I'm running their budgets. And then he's poached to go to another organization in Iowa. We invest in the training. Once they're trained, they leave. And that revolving door costs a tremendous amount of money. We try to solve those kinds of problems. Obviously, riots and escapes are not something that we can tolerate, so we put those dollars where we can. I believe in this one, though, we were able to extend it to parole officers as well, but that's about as far as we were able to go with getting it outside of simply corrections officers. And then also, as I mentioned, Wildlife and Parks. We already took care of the Highway Patrol pay plan, and that worked. I mean, you can see the evidence of it. Just drive up to Marymount anytime you'd like. Our graduating classes set records every year. They went from 0 in a class, 6 in a class, to just the mention of having that pay plan and it being passed, not implemented yet, but it was signed into law, brought us up to 20, and then every class after that had about 45 recruits in it. So in a course of just 4 classes, going from 0, nobody wanted to do it, to 45, 40, 38, another 45. Having classes of that size and being able to actually solve that problem, that's what we attempt to do when we go into these budget discussions, because we have real problems. When you have 300 highway patrolmen and you need about 550 to cover the state, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, shift after shift, without putting them on constant overtime, solving those problems makes the most sense first, and then dealing with the rest later. And the same thing goes with corrections. Having 18-hour shifts, having being down 40% on employees to be able to do 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, shift after shift. We can't have a corrections officer who is unarmed in a prison around felons having their back up on the 16th hour of a 16-hour shift. That's not acceptable. And the number of escapes that we saw over the past summer, the public safety being put at risk, those kinds of problems have to be solved. They must be solved. And then, you know, when there's an issue somewhere else, we go solve those problems. But as long as there's not tremendous turnover in a spot, that's just not something that becomes a priority, because, as I mentioned, there isn't a unlimited amount of money. There's not a tree that we get to go back to time and again to be able to do those kinds of things.
And I'd actually like to back Representative Clays up on that a little bit. While it gets to the fact that not all problems can be solved and they're stuck trying to figure out which ones to get to, he has worked tirelessly to try and defend public safety across the board and how to come up with resources against many of us, myself included, that keep hacking his budgets to try and come up with how we fit everything together. And we had, at the end of the last forum, a very quick and unscientific poll of who was here for the few of you that remember, and I thank you for participating in it. But that gets us to the challenge. How do we handle the resources? I rightly have received a lot of calls from unhappy taxpayers who had a much larger tax bill this year than they had last year due to the tax change that was passed last year. I understand that. I certainly understand their frustration, and they are not happy. I get that. Last time we looked at what areas we wanted to fund, and to go back further, and something we talk about a lot as we deal with appropriations, is in the case, the lawsuit, the lead attorney, Alan Roop, for the plaintiff had said other very important areas that don't have constitutional protection may have to suffer. We do see that, and we want to try to balance that, because I don't think it is education's goal to make other things suffer. But how do we achieve all of those in balance? The last time in that poll that I referenced, and somebody else wants to weigh in on this as well, which is great. They're calling in. Anyway, but we had about 12 of the people say that education was what needed the most money. We had about 5 say mental health was the most important, and we had a smattering of others that didn't reach quite the same level on the relative importance. But people got that that was there. People were aware of that. The awareness for corrections comes up when there is that big fire that has to be put out, and it is hard to defend, to get enough money. And it is so important there, because when I am short, I deal with the safety of every one of you that serves in the prison. And how do we make sure that that's staffing? And that is the nature of the overall problem, is to say, how do we do that? How much more can we pull from the tree? So some of us thought we could pull this level of income from the tree that's there. I definitely hear from those who think we can't. Perhaps there is more. But it is that balance that has to be achieved. And I just wanted to give some backup. Many things have been delivered, but many are not there. The average pay of our corrections officers from a number that are there, as you compare that to other jobs that are available, we are very fortunate to have those people working, just as we are very fortunate to have people working in all the other areas that I mentioned. I thank each of you that work for the state in schools and corrections and mental health for your service, because that is tremendous.
I'd like to add to that. I serve on the general government budget, on the fee funding taxes. The one big one this year was judiciary. There are members who work in our courthouses, in our law enforcement, and have not had any raises. And you really have to look at the whole picture. What happened from 2012, my first year, 2013, forward. We have been working to try to take care of the error that was done in 2012, deficiency in funds. And so we are faced with trying to come up with a plan that people will agree with. None of us like to have our taxes increased. But if you really look back, the amount that is being charged now is actually on your brackets is less than it was in 2012. So we are simultaneously right now trying to figure out two things: where the money's going to come from and who's going to benefit from it. And the prisons, judiciary, there are numerous occupations right now that have not seen any type of a pay increase. Our court clerks. And we recommended in the general government budget to increase the amount of money being paid to the judiciary for those types of services. These people have not seen any type of raises. Got to appropriations, and it was cut down to zero. And I see the frustration that appropriations has, is that where is this money coming from? And when I try to answer when people say, well, you're increasing our taxes, if you look at it, none of us like to have to pay taxes, but if you really realistically look at it, I look at the human side of the factor. I am not perhaps as astute in all of the figures as the representative sitting beside me, but that's his obligation being on the tax chair. My obligation is seeing where this money is going to go to for those individuals who live in our communities, who live in the communities that have these prisons, the communities that are our courthouse right now, that are not receiving the type of compensation that we need. But we have to do this in baby steps. And to understand and have our taxpayers understand that we're not just out there trying to load all this money up at one time, because the money still isn't there. We have a hole to fill for over this last 4 years. So if people can understand that and just hang in there with us, all of us are there at the same idea and thought process. What is the best way to correct what has happened due to the depletion of funds for this since 2013, and slowly build that resources back up again so that people are receiving the judiciary and people that we're talking about now. And there are other entities that are government-based that are not receiving any type of raises. So I think that's really the core, and just realize that those who are sitting up here are doing their level best, and our colleagues that we work with on the House side and on the Senate side are working diligently to correct this horrible occurrence that happened since 2013. So just hang in there with us. We're here for you. Thanks.
Maybe on that same, we only have about 10 minutes left, and I would like to get to a couple of other questions, but maybe on that same, Representative Dirks, I think, brought up something that is in a couple of questions up here, and that is, Could you comment kind of on your willingness to raise perhaps something like sales tax to raise revenue, or other ways of raising revenue? Maybe if you could just quickly comment on your willingness to do things like that.
I'll start this time. You know, I'm not in the business of wanting to raise taxes another time, at least until a true need presents itself. What we did last year, I think, took a large step in getting the Kansas back on a stable financial footing. And I do know that 2 days after we passed the tax bill, that Moody's, the rating agency, changed our status from negative to positive. And to me, that was an affirmation that what we had done in 2017 was a strong step in getting Kansas back on the road to fiscal stability. And I'm hopeful that we are done raising taxes. I may be optimistic, but I'd like to think that once we get since we've gotten the small businesses going from a 0% back up to some percentage of tax liability, that will provide us sufficient tax revenue to address the obligations or the priorities that Kansans think are important.
So I'd go to the sensible policy piece again. It's not always raising taxes, but I'm absolutely willing to look at tax changes and try to think about that each year. So where I start, so am I willing to raise sales tax? The short answer is probably no. Sales tax, we're at 6.5%. We are the highest in the region. Yeah, Arkansas matches us at 6.5%, but nobody else touches us. And you start creating issues, particularly along the eastern border, as you push that lever ever further. I don't disagree that that's not a bad tax to have and use, but I think that lever's gone pretty far. Property tax is one I really like to stay away from at the state level and leave that as a local tool more than a state tool. So things that I do look at, I did look at the income tax. I think we're where we need to be on that at the moment, and the key is not looking only at the rate, but looking at the base. To what does that rate apply? And that's what led me to look at, it appeared that the gap was widening on the LLCs rather than staying static. That creates concern for me. When I see something that does not perform consistently, I wonder what is the other element of change. On sales tax, I am worried about the base. Again, for the last 2 years, I've put forward bills to give a consideration to collecting sales on the internet, as Washington State does, as Massachusetts, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Minnesota. We work to follow theirs that are being implemented and are being effective at actually collecting more tax. More people are getting on board with that. Local businesses want a level playing field. Now the big businesses like Amazon are getting behind it because they have to collect tax, and many of their competitors advertise, if you buy on my site, you don't have to collect tax. Eventually we'll get Congress to act, but I am not sure when. That's been said for over a decade, I think. So that is one that I think is important for us for a variety of reasons. And there is revenue there. It's not a new tax. We owe it, but we don't collect it. We don't pay it typically. Other things, sales tax exemptions. We put a bill forward from the committee last year to start limiting exemptions. We have taken a firm stand to not continue to grow them. There are some very good cases for exemptions, but if we can go the other way to, again, broaden that base and keep everything in balance, we're at a point where increasing rates can be a challenge, but those are some of the things that we put forward to make sure that we balance both the needs for the money tree and a consistent tax policy that will serve us not only this year, but keeps us from being in a position as the internet sales take more and more, our sales tax base is shrinking. So trying to look ahead and anticipate where that is what I have thought is the key in setting a tax policy that would work.
Go ahead.
Well, I just echo the concerns over the sales tax. You know, it being one of the highest in the nation, especially when it comes to things like food, it puts us at a significant disadvantage. So I didn't vote for the increases in the past, and I wouldn't going forward. And I think there comes a point in time where you start to see a tremendous amount of tax avoidance, and not necessarily just the going online to shop type tax avoidance, but actually the criminal kind. When those rates start reaching certain amounts, when you start tacking on the local, and some of those districts, like where we're seeing, you know, Nebraska Furniture Mart or whatever, those start approaching 10%. I think the part where you run into tax avoidance of the other kind is when you, I think I saw some statistics that say about 12 cents on the dollar, and we definitely don't want to start approaching that. It kills commerce. So yeah, I think it's very difficult to go towards that tax. There isn't really one that I think I would be comfortable raising at this stage. One of the things that we don't talk a lot about is our government and all of our agencies doing all the things they need to be doing and providing the services that they need to provide. And the way that that's been done in the past, before the Brownback-Collier administration, when they started breaking the law, was you would receive current resources budgets in the Appropriations Committee. And essentially what that does is it forces the governor to say, our projection for revenue is this, and here is our budget that fits that projection for revenue. What the Brownback-Collier administration did was said, here's our projection for revenue, here's our budget, it goes beyond that, here's a tax on tobacco. And if you read the law, it says very specifically that, no, you don't get to do that. But he did it, and the Brownback-Collier administration continually did that instead of going to the agencies and saying, if we had to do cuts, where would you cut? And what that does for us when we're in the Appropriations Committee, and we're only there for 3 months, so you have to understand that we don't really get an opportunity to go in and dive into an agency and start picking apart the books. But what that allows us to do is say, well, look, the agency says that this program would be the one on the chopping block. Let's take a closer look at that. We can then spend our time going in and taking a look at that. Is that an important program? Is that something that we truly need? Is it providing the most efficient service? Does it have the outcomes that it's stated? And if it does, we can say, yeah, let's keep funding that. And if it doesn't, we can say, gosh, we should probably take another look at even providing that service or having that program exist if it's not meeting the outcomes, if it's not cost effective. So for years and years and years, government has grown unabated in that fashion because we haven't been given the tools we need to be able to make those determinations. We did some experiments with things like priority-based budgeting and zero-based budgeting. In the Department of Agriculture, for instance, and this is really instructive because I think it helps you understand how prioritization can help. When we did zero-based budgeting in the Department of Agriculture, their budget was roughly $46 million. That's what we budget for them. We found out that it really takes about $47 million. It's $1 million more. Zero-based budgeting told us it costs more. But what it also told us was they spent $2 million on something that really only needed $1 million to be able to produce the same result, and they spent $1 million on something that needed $2 million to produce the same result. Oh, and they had 3 programs that really didn't produce very good results at all for the money that we were putting in. That's the kind of budgeting that should take place in our state government so that we're spending the dollars where they need to be spent, and then it doesn't require these kinds of tax increases to go through that process. The Department of Agriculture serves as a great example of that, and if we were to do that to each of our agencies, we could come up with a much more efficient government and not be wasting taxpayer dollars.
Okay. Really quick, last one. Senator Hardy, your comment, I think, on industrial hemp just prompted a couple of questions. One being, how would that affect other crops and resources in the state? And then also just if you could comment quickly maybe on any negative effects of industrial hemp.
Industrial hemp is different than marijuana, and so there should be no conflict there. The reason that it's in research is that we want to make sure that there are not unintended consequences and people understand what we're looking at. There are I've heard 100,000 different things you can do with industrial hemp. And it has the potential, and Representative Johnson actually knows more about industrial hemp than I do, but it has a great potential as a cash crop in Kansas. And I think that what it would do is it would take some of the pressure off of the other crops that are being squeezed either by tariff or by the supply and demand. And so I think it adds another tool to the toolbox, basically, for the farmers to consider in making those decisions. The other thing is it's because of the nature of industrial hemp, it does not provide problems with trying to deal with marijuana, which is a whole different subject and should be considered, but considered separately.
Thank you. Yep, you've got a couple of minutes.
So thanks, and thanks to Senator Hardy for mentioning this. I was excited that this worked. So we're doing it because the Farm Bill allows research, but only research so far from the 2014 U.S. Farm Bill. So that opened the window to be able to start, and there's a lot that can be done with it, as Senator mentioned. So we started in 2015, and it was a fairly long process, but it finally got across and was signed yesterday. So I was excited that it was signed, although I thought ironic that it was on 420, for those of you following the math, because it has nothing to do with that other than it's in the same family. But it took a lot of work with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to get them comfortable with the concept, just how will this work. So we had to get a lot of information. How is it handled? And it really doesn't fit with the other crops in the bottom line. But the Kansas Bureau of Investigation was very concerned about that. They and the Department of Agriculture had concerns with that. We feel we were finally able to address their concerns thanks to a lot of folks from Russell and Colby who came in. The implement dealer from Colby sells equipment to Colorado, and it is amazing equipment, and he'd love to sell it in Kansas. The baler costs $400,000, and it's pretty remarkable, but Kansas has some expertise in building balers. I bet we could build one for half that right here. And so there are a lot of things related to it, and Representative Clays has been on the Commerce Committee, and the chance for growth actually really fits with Kansas. So we could lose some acres of other crops. So if I was really wanting acres of other crops, and that was my goal, perhaps I could call that a minus. But looking at the big picture, getting them to the most productive, that's really key. The other thing that it helped in an ancillary way, as we got KBI comfortable with industrial hemp over the last 3 years, the CBD oil that doesn't have THC also was able to come along in the Health Committee, and the CBD oil is approved. So again, the non-THC pieces we've been able to move with. When we touch the THC, there are actually useful parts of medical marijuana, but the key is distribution. So if you can help us solve the distribution and control issue beyond that, we could look at other things, but some pretty big strides were made. I don't see a lot of downsides at this point. A possible downside of the industrial, I think it was a weed at one point that was pretty hard to get rid of. So as Russell County might step in and find out as birds carry those seeds other places, maybe the return on it is not as great as the invasive species somewhere else. And we could find that out, but I look forward to trying to learn more about it, and that's at the stage that we are. I don't see a lot of downsides. KBI thought they needed equipment, a spectrometer and other things. We have it at the Department of Agriculture. We were comfortable using that equipment, not replicating it in terms of cost for the Bureau at this point in time, but we'll continue to see if there are any other things that prop up.
No pun intended, huh?
I was very happy to go along with this because simply, we have the aquifer out in western Kansas, that we're afraid of depreciating that. And this particular crop is actually great for dry areas, so it'll be an opportunity for those who are farming out in western Kansas. Does not require the amount of water that wheat and some of the other crops that they're growing out there. I think it would be a big boost to our economy here in Kansas, and I would certainly fully support that. Thank you.
I don't know there's much I'd add to that, except to thank Representative Johnson for his diligence on this issue. It's taken several years to get to where we are now, and he's right. The crop itself, being able to have other alternatives that take less water, and then also the opportunity for manufacturing when it comes to harvesting that crop. There are some benefits to that directly impact us here, right here in Salina.
Okay, thank you all. I do sincerely apologize if I didn't get to your questions. I try to group them, but we only did three, which might be a record for the times I've done this. There's only three that we didn't answer. So again, I'm sorry if we didn't get to it. We have about 2 minutes each for your closing remarks. So if you could just kind of watch the clock, because again, I want to remind everybody we got to clear the room pretty quick because we do have another group coming in. So I want to thank everybody for coming in the audience. Obviously, certainly thank the legislators for coming. We certainly appreciate your time. So again, about 2 minutes each for closing remarks.
Thank you very much for attending, everyone. This is a great opportunity to communicate our thoughts to you and for you to communicate your thoughts to us. And I'm looking forward to going back for what they call the veto session. I don't see any vetoes necessarily in our future, but it'll be a time for us to try to wrap up unfinished business. And I think I'm confident, I'm an optimist, that we'll be able to do that. We have a very short period of time given for that process, but we'll just try as hard as we can, I guess. But if you have any questions, concerns, issues, I'm always happy to talk with you about those. You know, that's the way we get things done in this state. I appreciate your participation.
Thank you for being here. Great to get to be with you. I already got to talk about industrial hemp and capers, so that pretty well made my day to start with. And look forward to your continued input as we look to the balance of what is important, how we measure what's important, and how we get there and keep things in balance. So as we head back, the good thing about only having 8 days is I think we'll be focused on what we have to get done going in. I think there will be a plan. I don't think we'll waste time on the first day. I think that we will be about the business of getting it wrapped up. So I kind of like that. It's actually not a traditional veto session, as Senator Hardy mentioned, because a governor can hold a bill for 10 days. So should he wish to veto anything, pretty much his choice. We're only there for 8, and we'll be gone. So, but adjournment on the 4th will be kind of nice to be able to come back and do things on the farm. And I certainly have been working. Folks even currently are texting on what to do on tax and budget stuff. So we'll continue to really spend time as we even get ready to go to Topeka to make sure that we have things together to get wrapped up. So thanks for being here.
Thanks once again for all of you being here. It's always great to see a nice crowd here and to ask, and great questions were asked. I hope that we were able to answer most of them efficiently. This here is what I always consider one of the best highlights of being a legislator, is when groups of our constituents, whether they're in my district or the other representatives in Senate, is your interest in the questions that you ask. And I hope that you have most of them answered to your satisfaction, and be sure and visit with your friends and neighbors if they have the same questions. And we are always available. I did leave a sheet of paper in the back if you would like to receive my newsletter. I try to keep in communication with my constituents even though we would no longer be in session. I'm always available. But thanks again for being here and for the great questions that you had for us today, and hope that we answered them to your satisfaction.
Thank you again to AT&T and the Chamber. Just a couple of items. I mentioned at the outset that there will be a task force to create the next iteration of T-Works, or a comprehensive transportation program. I'll be serving as a member of that task force. That should be lined up during this veto session, and we'll have that lined up. So I look forward to getting a lot of local input on what we want out of a a transportation plan, whether that be a shorter version or a 10-year plan. Also want to point out that there is the Exponential Conference is being held in Denver. I'm going to attend that with the Salina Community Economic Development Organization and also K-State Polytechnic, amongst others who have partnered with KDOT Aviation to have a tremendous presence at that conference. It's conferences like that where we come up with great ideas like creating career and tech ed programs in unmanned aircraft systems. That's going to be a statewide program. Those conferences end up really doing a lot for not just our state, but specifically for Salina and our community. So I look forward to attending that and representing Salina and Kansas there. And then also in early June, I'm going to be speaking to the Kansas Society of Professional Engineers at their annual conference in Manhattan. That's a group that represents our engineers who work for KDOT and then also the private companies that build our transportation infrastructure, and that's going to be in June. And I think that's about it, but I, again, just appreciate everyone coming out here and appreciate AT&T and the chamber.
All right, thank you very much.